That's 5 from the SEC that I think will make the initial 12-team playoff. Feels like a lot, feels like a little. Let us know. I really think the SEC's depth and the fact that you're going to have a bunch of teams with pretty dang good records and pretty good resumes, going to have them well positioned. Hello and welcome in. It's always college football. Today is Wednesday, August 21st, and it's a very important day because today it's official. Today we etch our predictions in stone. We have long speculated for the last 8 months how we might lean when evaluating some of these teams. We've long considered possibilities and whether or not we're going to take some flyers. But today is the day. I'm your host, Greg McElroy. Along with me, as always, the usual crew. Jack, Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack. Everybody's here, all right? But today's a very special day. We've given you our top 25. That was a few weeks back. So there have been a couple tweaks based on some buzz coming out of fall camp. We've also basically told you some dark horses over the last few years. And if you want to go back, just for the record, last couple years, nobody in the preseason has been more accurate, for the most part, than us when evaluating conference champions. Last year in the Power 5, we were 5 for 5 in picking the conference champion. That's right. We had Texas. We had Washington. A lot of people didn't. We did. We had Alabama last year over Georgia. We also had Florida State in the ACC, and not a huge surprise that we had Michigan in the Big Ten. We were 5 for 5 last year. The year before, you look at some of the teams that we've had playing for the conference championship. The year before, we had North Carolina playing for the ACC. Last year, we had Louisville playing for the ACC Championship. Not many people did, but we did. So we've been very, very good in being able to predict who is going to do what. We also picked Georgia to win the national championship 2 years ago, and we picked Michigan to win the national championship last year. So if there's nothing you listen to at all, this might be the show that you might want to be paying attention to. Now, are we due for a bad year? Probably, considering I just cited a record. But I think we put a lot of time and effort into these predictions, and we feel pretty good about them. But it's always a risk. So without much further ado, our hold me to them, set in stone predictions here for 2024. Let's start off in the ACC. 3 contenders here in our eyes. With all due respect to NC State, with all due respect to Virginia Tech, the 3 teams that we really whittled it down to are the 3 that you'd probably expect: Florida State, Miami, and Clemson. And it's very difficult to kind of differentiate between the two. When you look at the schedules, so much of this has to do with personnel schedules. It's got to be some type of a blend between the two. The reason why we liked Louisville last year in the ACC is because their schedule was extremely manageable. Same can be said for North Carolina the year before. Then I looked at some of the schedules this year. It's like, well, North Carolina's schedule is pretty good, but there's just too many question marks for me to feel great about putting them in the conference title. I feel like I'm hedging my bets here. I'm taking the 3 most talented teams, the 3 best rosters, and then I'm going to whittle it down based on how things might line up in their schedules. Let's start with the defending ACC champs, the Florida State Seminoles. You look at their schedule, I think things get off to a very tricky start here in week number 0. That's right, number 0. Road trip. I know it's against Georgia Tech. I know that's a neutral site. I think that's a remarkably challenging game. I think they also have a difficult game against the G5 team in Memphis, a team that I'm going to talk probably a little bit about a little later in the season. Who knows what Florida will be by the time they play them, but those are not games that are going to have a huge impact on whether or not they go to the ACC title. The games that I'm focusing on for Florida State that could determine whether or not they repeat as conference champs: at SMU on September 28th. That's a big one. Clemson comes to them. That game might be really pivotal when we evaluate how things are going here in just a moment. And then they go to Miami, where they'll be probably a slight favorite right now, but that might not be the case here a little bit further down the road. People are going to say, well, what about the Notre Dame game? It doesn't have to do with the ACC Championship. It has exclusively to do with where they might rank if they're making a play as an at-large team in the college football playoff. But I look at those and I think there's 3 or 4 games that are really challenging in the ACC. Ultimately, I think Florida State's probably a 6-2 football team in the ACC. I think they're 9-3 overall, thereabouts, which would have them in prime position. Let's go next to Miami. Miami, very difficult game week 1 against Florida, but that doesn't have any indicator of whether or not they'll compete for their conference title. The tough games on the schedule for them at Louisville. Very tough game. They're on October 19th. Colin Lacey, Louisville star receiver, broken collarbone. Does he return on October 19th to face Miami? Florida State, also another difficult game. That game's October 26th. So back-to-back, maybe your 2 toughest games on the schedule for Miami. They are right next to each other. They are coming off the bye week, though, and there is a sneaky tough game in there for me. That's a road trip to Cal on October 5th. Could be a 10:30 start Eastern time. That might be a little challenging for the body clock, especially at the tail end of what should be a 5-game stretch between Florida, Florida A&M, Ball State, at South Florida, Virginia Tech. Those are 5. And then you have that at Cal game. Very, very tough to kind of have that there at the end in the 6th game of the season. So I look at it, I think Miami's a 10-2 football team. And I think if they really only have those 2 super difficult games at Louisville, Florida State at home, do they split those 2? And are they 7-1 at the end of the day? And then finally, the Clemson Tigers. Do not sleep on Clemson. Everyone seems to be. I don't think you should. Georgia in the non-con, we're going to find out exactly where they set up week 1. Tough schedule. But I look at how their schedule sets up, and you tell me, how confident are you in picking a team against Clemson at Clemson? I can tell you this much. I've been to Death Valley. I don't feel real confident picking teams to go into Tiger Stadium and to get a win against the Clemson Tigers. I don't anticipate that happening very often. So NC State, it's going to be tough sledding for NC State there in week 3. They go to Florida State. Very pivotal game. You'll find out based on kind of how I feel, who I think might win that game if it were played today. They also have Louisville that comes to them. I think Clemson will handle their business in that situation. A couple tough road trips at Virginia Tech. I think that's a tricky one. We already referenced the Florida State game, so it's not an easy schedule by any stretch of the imagination, especially when you take into account what I think is an underrated South Carolina team at the end of the year, and then Georgia in the non-con. 2 tough games. I think Clemson's a 9-3 football team. Thereabouts. Probably 6-2 in the league. But the conference championship game, in our estimation, will be between Miami and the Florida State Seminoles, and we are taking the Miami Hurricanes. At this point, there's more known commodities on the roster. They've been able to really upgrade at just about every position. Now, are there a couple question marks in the back end defensively? Yes. But they did go out and bring in a guy like Mish Powell from Washington. They feel pretty good about him filling in on one of those safety spots. I didn't feel like their secondary was great last year. So I think another year in Lance Guidry's system defensively, they're going to be able to take the next step. So we're taking Miami to win the ACC and punch their ticket to the playoff over Florida State. So Florida State, much like last year, will be waiting around on selection day to find out whether or not they are in. Let's move next to the Big 12. Big 12 is a really solid league. When you're starting to go through the schedules and you think about the contenders, there's a bunch of teams that are going to actually have a bunch of games that are within 5 or 6, 7 points on the point spread. As you do look ahead lines right now for a lot of these teams, man, I mean, Utah plays 4 or 5 games that are all inside of a touchdown in one direction or the other. Oklahoma State the same, Kansas the same, Kansas State the same, Iowa State the same. TCU, frankly, look ahead lines have them in an underdog in multiple spots, but all the games are within 6 or 7 points. So this could be a league where you just flip a coin, man. There's 6 or 7 teams that we might be talking about at the beginning of November, and then it's just survival of the fittest at that point. However, the team that I think is best equipped to navigate the schedule and find their way into the Big 12 title game is the Utah Utes. You look at their schedule and how things set up. We know their personnel. We know that they're going to defend you in the front seven defensively. We know that their identity is going to be being extremely physical along both lines of scrimmage. I think that translates really nicely to this league. The league, people still, in backwards world, still envision the Big 12 as a league that's going to air it out. Like Patrick Mahomes and Baker Mayfield are still going toe-to-toe in a 66-58 beatdown. That's not what the Big 12 is anymore. The Big 12 is about the line of scrimmage, ground and pound, physical in the front seven defensively, with, I think, pretty dang good running backs across the board. Texas Tech has an elite running back. Oklahoma State, obviously, with Ollie Gordon, has an elite running back. I think Cam Rising at Utah, not a running back, but a quarterback that can definitely keep you honest with his legs. They have a great rushing attack. You look at what Kansas has. Devin Neal and the speed that they have. Tons of great speed at running back. Like, this is a league that wants to emphasize the line of scrimmage and run the football. I think Utah's best equipped to handle that. Now, their toughest game on the road at Oklahoma State. Then the rest of their games are, for the most part, relatively manageable. Iowa State comes to them. I think it's a really tough game. They're on November 23rd. They're at UCF. Be careful in that spot on the road at UCF. Probably going to be a slight favorite there, but that will be a really tough game. Then they're on the road at Colorado as well. However, I look at Utah's schedule. I think they can get to 10-2. I think they could be 7-2 in the Big 12. So if they lose, let's say, the Arizona game and the Oklahoma State game, I think they're still in a really good spot, even if they were to lose those two games, to find their way in a league that embodies carnage to the Big 12 title game. Let's go to who I think they might be facing off against. Few teams that were under consideration. So I'll tell you who those three teams are. Let's start with Oklahoma State. They got there last year. Very, very tough schedule. Utah comes to them, but they're at Kansas State. That's in consecutive weeks. Then, doesn't get much easier than that. You have to play another game against a super physical West Virginia team. That is a 3-game stretch that will be brutal. They finally get to breathe a sigh of relief after that, where they get their bye and they have back-to-back road trips to BYU and Baylor. So I look at their schedule, Oklahoma State, I think it's really tough. I think the toughest game that nobody's going to talk about here in the preseason is at TCU, where they'll probably be a slight favorite, but TCU at that point, maybe TCU's figured out who they need to be. Maybe some of those transfers over the last couple of years really start to lean into who TCU can be, and that might be a very tricky one for them. Texas Tech goes to them. They're at Colorado at the end of the year. Colorado, maybe at that point, Colorado needs it to get to bowl eligibility, so be careful there. I still think with what Oklahoma State returns, their identity offensively and the identity of the league and where it's likely going has me still feeling really good about the Pokes. 9-3, 7-2 in the league would not be that surprising. But let's get to Kansas State and Kansas quickly before I tell you who I think will be playing in the Big 12 title game. Kansas State, tough games. You look at that Arizona game in week 3, that is not a conference game. So people will say, oh, well, they get Arizona. It's at home. That's bad news for the Wildcats. They're going to be a game and a half back Kansas State. If they lose that one on the road in Manhattan, that doesn't matter. Not in conference. That was scheduled out of conference, and they kept it here, even though Arizona and Kansas State are in the same league. Tough games for Kansas State. At Colorado, should be a tight one. At West Virginia, should be a tight one. Kansas comes to them, should be a tight one. And then you have Iowa State on the road at the end of the year. I mean, that's 4 very losable games in conference. So it could be tough to see them get to, say, 10-2, 7-2 in the league. I think they're more like a 9-3, 6-3 team in the Big 12. And then finally, the Kansas Jayhawks. Really like this team, but so much of it will be dependent on whether or not their quarterback can stay healthy. If Jalen Daniels is healthy for 12 games, feel great about the possibilities of them crashing the playoff party. But that is a big if, given the fact that Jalen Daniels only played, 12 games in the last 2 years? So got to know he's available, got to know he's in a good spot. It's nice to know that they avoid Utah and they avoid Oklahoma State, but still some question marks about their defense and a quarterback that's been a little in and out of the lineup. It's hard for me to envision Kansas doing a whole lot better than a 9-3, 6-3 in the Big 12. You look at some of the games, the Iowa State game at home should be very tough. They're at Kansas State. That'll be tough. TCU comes to them. That'll be tough. And at West Virginia there on September 21st, another game that I think is very losable for Kansas. So I think they're 9-3, 6-3 in the league. So I just told you, I got Kansas State at 6-3 in the league. I have Oklahoma State and Utah at 7-2 in the league. That means Oklahoma State and Utah will be playing for the Big 12 title game in our eyes, and the winner is the Utah Utes. Looking at their quarterback, looking at their personnel at the wide receiver spot, and their long leaned into identity of being a team that wants to pound you, I think it sets up really well for them to transition to this league and have immediate success. I think the Pac-12 was a league that was won on the perimeter, but Utah forced teams to play their way. Now, I think more teams in the Big 12 will be very comfortable playing the way Utah wants to play. But because of how Utah has had to adapt, they've brought in quality personnel at wide receiver, and Cam Rising's experience ultimately gives them an edge. And when they're playing against Alan Bowman, their passing attack at Utah, I think, gives them a slight edge over the Oklahoma State Cowboys. So Utah is in at 11-2, the Big 12 champs, while Oklahoma State sits on Selection Day awaiting their future. Moving into the Big 10. 3 teams that I think are going to be competing for the Big 10 title. And one of those is not the defending champ. I know it's dramatic. I know that feels like a bold strategy, and I will love to be proven wrong. Be awesome. We've been on the Michigan bandwagon for 3 years now, but I think with the pieces that were lost and the schedule, it's just too steep of a hill to climb. So to anticipate them being up there alongside Ohio State, Oregon, Penn State, and others, it's just a bridge too far for me at the moment. So we'll revisit this. I'll be the first one to eat crow. But I think most Michigan fans that are watching this know that we've been very supportive of Michigan over the last few years because we believed in what they had. This year, there's too many question marks on both sides of the ball for us to feel like they can go toe-to-toe with the top teams in the Big Ten. So let's start with the Ohio State Buckeyes. They're the odds-on favorite right now. Schedule, very manageable. We've all circled the same game. We all know that game on October 12th at Oregon will ultimately decide whether or not they're the home team or the away team potentially in the Big Ten title game. Outside of that game, you tell me where they're going to lose. Now, you can tell me, well, they've at Penn State. I am in see it to believe it mode with Penn State. I love Penn State's personnel. I love their roster. I think they have a lot of things that you would really like and the home field at their disposal. Man, sign me up for Penn State. I have to see James Franklin knock off Ohio State before I can comfortably pick that in the preseason. I just can't. So with all due respect to Penn State, I think at this point, I cannot envision them pulling off that upset. But at Oregon, at Penn State, those are the two tricky ones. And of course, Michigan, the fly in the ointment the last couple of years for Ohio State. That game will be in Columbus this year at the end of the year. But tell me this. Do you really think they're going to lose 2 out of 3 there? Do you think they're going to lose 1 out of 3? Could they go undefeated in those 3 games? I think it's all possible. They'll be favored in every game, potentially, with the exception of the road trip to Oregon. But I still think Ohio State, at worst, drops 1 of those 3. Even if they drop 2, they're still in a really good spot to potentially get to the Big Ten title game. Let's go next to the team that's currently universally picked second in the Big Ten. That's the Oregon Ducks. And you look at the schedule, they'll get a nice test early against Boise State. They'll have a road trip to Oregon State. They're 2 tough games in the first 3 weeks that should get them prepared for what should be coming in the weeks to come. They, of course, host Ohio State on October 12th. Talked about that game already. And a couple other tricky ones. At Michigan on November 2nd. That'll be very tough. On the road at Michigan, defending champs. I like Oregon's personnel a little bit more than I like Michigan's at the moment. I think the at Wisconsin game's a little tricky as well. But you look at the schedule. If they can beat Ohio State, they could drop, in theory, 1, maybe 2, and still get to the Big Ten title game. So I like Oregon to be in that spot, 11-1, 8-1 in the conference. Same can be said for Ohio State. And then finally, we get to Penn State. Where is Penn State going to end up here? Now, we're going to find a lot out about Penn State in week 1 on the road at West Virginia. I think West Virginia is a really good football team. They're a physical football team. They know who they are. And if Penn State can go on the road and get that win and win comfortably, I'm going to feel even better about their candidacy in the Big Ten moving forward. But that game is purely just kind of a litmus test for the Big 12 more than it is the Big 10, because Penn State's still going to have plenty of opportunities sitting right in front of them to go and prove their worth. I look at the rest of the schedule throughout the first week of October and all through September. I have a hard time envisioning them slipping up at any point in the first month and change of the season. First really big test in conferences at SC. That's probably going to be a tough game. SC at that point offensively might have everything rolling, and I think Penn State's defense will be up to the task, but that's a significant test on the road against the Trojans. At Wisconsin, a couple weeks later after the bye week, we'll find out exactly where they're at right there prior to they play against Ohio State. Be careful on the road at Wisconsin. That's all I'm saying. When you have that Ohio State game circled on November 2nd, and you have to go to Wisconsin the week before coming out of the bye week, just be careful is all I'm suggesting. Washington comes to them, and they're at Purdue, at Minnesota before Maryland finishes up the regular season. I'd be really surprised if Penn State wasn't 10-2 in the regular season. I really would. I think they're going to be 10-2. I think they're going to be 7-2 in the conference. So I think they're in a really good spot. I mean, considering the fact that James Franklin is 21-5 in the last 2 years, he's been pretty dang good. He beats the teams he's supposed to beat, but he can't quite get over the hump against the top teams in the sport. That's why I have them losing to Ohio State, and I have them losing at least one more. I just don't know which one that is just yet. Is it at SC? Is it at Wisconsin? I'm not 100% sure, but I think they'll lose one other one. So 10-2 for Penn State, 7-2 overall, and they'll be sitting there at home on conference championship weekend because Oregon and Ohio State will play in a rematch. I think both teams are going to be 11-1, 8-1 in the conference, and ultimately they're at the neutral site in a dome. I'm taking the Ohio State Buckeyes to beat the Oregon Ducks in the Big Ten title game and punch their ticket to the playoff, which means Oregon and Penn State still well positioned to be an at-large, but they'll be sitting there awaiting their fate on Selection Day that Sunday after the conference title games. And finally, before we get to the SEC, isn't this fun? We're talking about so many teams that are ultimately going to be in the playoff. We'll tell you who our playoff is. I'll tell you what rankings and seedings that I think how it all play out. But man, it's just fun just to think about the possibilities and the amount of teams that might be under consideration if things play out the way we think they're going to play out. Let's move to the SEC. There's going to be a lot of teams in the SEC that are in the playoff discussion, okay? There always has been. There always will be. It's a remarkably deep league. It's a remarkably talented league. They play 8 conference games, so they're going to have better records than some teams that might play 9 conference games in some cases. So the SEC, I think, is poised to get at least 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 teams into the college football playoff. But let's start at the top. Who's going to be playing for the SEC Championship? We'll start with the Georgia Bulldogs. They're the odds-on favorite at the moment. You look at their schedule, tough non-conference. Georgia Tech's a good team. Clemson's a good team. They're a comfortable favorite in both of those 2 games. Here's where it gets very tricky for Georgia. Road trip at Bama. That's on November 28th. A road trip at Texas on October 19th. A neutral site game against Florida. A road trip at Ole Miss on November 9th. But still, I still think there's a gap that exists between Georgia and Ole Miss. Even though Ole Miss has gotten better along the line of scrimmage, I still think there's a gap there. So I look at Georgia, man, and with all the question marks about their defense, they still have the best personnel. They still have arguably the deepest roster, and they still might have the best quarterback in Carson Beck. I think Georgia's going to be in the mix at season's end. 11-1, 10-2 at the very worst. But will they get to the conference championship game? Let's see who they're going to be measured against. Let's go next to the Texas Longhorns. The Texas Longhorns have a road trip at Michigan in the non-conference. That'll help an awful lot to figure out exactly where they're going to be there. That's week 2, September 7th on the road in Ann Arbor. Neutral site game against Oklahoma is the next big challenge after that game. That's on October 12th. You get Georgia on October 19th. So how about that for a 2-game stretch before you have to go to Vanderbilt on the 26th. That's your October. Then you look at November. Florida at Arkansas, Kentucky's at home, and then at Texas A&M. I think the A&M game's really tough. I think the Georgia game's really tough. I think the Oklahoma game's really tough. So they have 3 games that I think are extremely difficult in conference. I think they could lose 2 out of 3. And Texas has played to the level of the competition in the past. So will they do that again against improved competition in the SEC? I think they might. I think there's going to be a period of transition, but ultimately they're probably a 10-2 football team, probably a 6-2 team in conference. And I think they'll get that win on the road at Michigan in the non-conference, which will help them from an at-large standpoint if they don't win the SEC. Moving on to Ole Miss. Ole Miss, if you look at their schedule, things are really, really nice for them. There's really two games that should stress you out significantly if you're an Ole Miss fan. On paper, preseason, at LSU and Georgia appear to be by far their most difficult games. Now, I think there's some dangerous games, a la at South Carolina on October 5th, at Florida on November 23rd. I think there's some real dangerous games on there. I think Oklahoma at home on October 26th, also a tricky game. But at this point, man, with them being at home, I think they'll be okay at home against some quality competition. I think they're better from a personnel standpoint significantly than what they might get at South Carolina as well. So Ole Miss, I think they're a 10-2 football team, 6-2 football team in conference, but their schedule strength will not be as good as the Texas Longhorns, who I think might ultimately have a similar record in conference, and that might affect who goes to the SEC Championship game. Let's go next to Alabama. Alabama's got a really solid schedule, very difficult schedule at Wisconsin in the non-conference. That's massive. They host Georgia, a team they've beaten 2 of the last 3. And the best run in Georgia's history. Bama's kind of had their number. They go to Tennessee, very tough game. Missouri comes to them, very tough game. At LSU, very tough game. And at Oklahoma, very tough game. The good news is for Alabama, the Iron Bowl is at home this year. So that game might not be as scary as it would be if it were in Jordan-Hare, but still, I think Alabama's primed and positioned to be a little bit of a sleeper this season. I know they're number 5 in the preseason, but they're not getting the same level of scrutiny as a Georgia, not the same level as a Texas. So I think they're able to fly under the radar a little bit. We might find out this Alabama team's actually quite a bit better than people realize on paper coming into the season, assuming their defense is as good as what I've heard they might be here this upcoming year. So I think they're in a good spot to be a 10-2 football team, 6-2 in conference. Let's move next to LSU. LSU is a team that people are starting to wake up on. Okay, they're starting to wake up and say, oh, you know what, Brian Kelly, if they can just be a little better on defense, this team becomes remarkably dangerous. They also have a really nice non-conference. They could have 2 wins against Big Ten teams, USC on a neutral site, UCLA in Baton Rouge. That could be really helpful. And South Alabama is supposed to be pretty good as well. So they might have 3 decent non-conference games to go along with what might be a really impressive conference record in the SEC. The schedule's not terrible. Ole Miss comes to them. Bama comes to them. They have to go to Florida. Oklahoma comes to them as well. We all know how hard it is to play in Baton Rouge. Well, when some of your toughest games are at home, that's a really solid recipe for success for the Bayou Bengals. I think we're looking at a 9-3 football team here for LSU. I think they got a chance to be 6-2 in the league, maybe 5-3 in the league. Will that be enough, though, to potentially get them an at-large spot, considering the strength of schedule that they're going to be going up against? It'll be close, that's for sure. We'll discuss it here in just a minute, and we'll finish the SEC conversation with Missouri. A lot of people like Missouri, understandably so. The schedule's extremely manageable. Oklahoma's at home. They have to go to South Carolina. Those are 2 of their toughest games. They have to go to Alabama. Very difficult game. Auburn comes to them. They have to go to A&M. All things considered, things look pretty good for Missouri on paper. The non-conference is extremely manageable. But I happen to think the ball might bounce the other way for Missouri this year. There were many, many instances last year in which they were on the fortunate side of a break or 2. I think those things have a tendency of correcting themselves this year. I think the Auburn game is going to be tough. I think the Oklahoma game is going to be tough. I think at South Carolina is incredibly difficult. I think at Mississippi State's one you got to be kind of careful about as well, because Mississippi State will be able to score. Some of the personnel losses defensively, I think, will be too much for Missouri to overcome. Ultimately, I think they're a 9-3 football team, 5-3 in the SEC. So without breaking down much more in the SEC, we broke down just about half the teams. Ultimately, I think the SEC Championship will be decided between the Texas Longhorns and the Georgia Bulldogs. And we are taking the Georgia Bulldogs to beat Texas in the conference championship. Still some things to figure out defensively, but Georgia has the fewest question marks. And in a league that's this deep and this talented, I think they can go toe-to-toe with anybody even in the event in which they have some losses because of injury. Okay, now that we have our 4 Power 4 champions established, let's tell you how things look for the 12-team playoff. As you know, the top 4 teams are all going to be Power 4 conference champions, okay? Barring something completely unforeseen, a la Memphis beating Florida State winning the ACC, Memphis being undefeated, therefore they have the head-to-head against Florida State. So they would be ahead, but probably not even in that scenario is that likely, okay? I think the top 4 teams are going to be very cut and dry. At number 1, given the scenario that we've already played out, the SEC champs is the Georgia Bulldogs, who I think are going to be around 12-1. Really good non-conference wins against Georgia Tech, who I think is a bowl team. Clemson, who's one of the best teams in the ACC and a potential at-large. So Georgia in at 12-1 as the number 1 overall seed. At number 2, the Ohio State Buckeyes, 12-1, the Big Ten champs. They will sit there and enjoy that bye week before they go and play in the quarterfinals. At number 3, the ACC champions, the Miami Hurricanes, who I have at 11-2. Remember, 12-1, 11-2. They have 13 data points to account for. Of course, with victory in the conference championship game, Miami goes from 10-2 to 11-2. They are the ACC champs. They are the number 3 overall seed. And at number 4, the Big 12 champs, the Utah Utes, who are also 11-2. Those are your top 4 teams. Those are your 4 teams with the bye. This is where it starts to get very interesting in the upcoming playoff expansion. At number 5, runner-up of the Big Ten Championship, the Oregon Ducks. The Oregon Ducks sitting there 11-1 in the regular season, lost the Big Ten title. They're sitting at 11-2. They lost to Ohio State. Great game. Still get the number 5 seed against the G5 champion, who we'll get to here in just a moment. At number 6, also hosting a college football playoff game in the opening round, the Texas Longhorns, who at 10-3 were the runners-up in the SEC Championship game. Are you starting to sense a trend here? Are you sensing a trend? Yes. I think the committee is going to reward teams and not penalize teams that play in the Big Ten and the SEC Championship game. So while Texas might come into conference championship Saturday as, say, the number 6th ranked team and lose to Georgia, who's the number 1 overall seed, it's not really going to make a huge difference. Texas isn't going to be penalized for having played an additional game. Why? Because the team that I have at number 7, the Alabama Crimson Tide, 10-2 overall. The SEC team that finished in 3rd place, just a little bit outside the conference championship title game for the SEC, but still in as an at-large. Texas played on conference championship Saturday, and while they have more losses than Alabama, they get the benefit of the doubt. They're sitting there in the 6th seed. Bama's in as the number 7 seed. At number 8, the Penn State Nittany Lions, also out of the Big Ten. Also the 3rd place team in the Big Ten, also at 10-2. Those are the 4 teams that I envision having home playoff games. 2 of the 4 played in a conference championship game. The other 2 got to sit at home and chill in the conference championship weekend. At number 9, the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. You're going to sit there and say, Notre Dame, that's interesting. First we've heard of them. Of course, no conference championship. And I think the committee will evaluate their schedule and they will not look upon Notre Dame as favorably as the 10-2 teams that sit right in front of them. Alabama and Penn State have a chance for massive wins against playoff caliber teams. Who is that win going to be for Notre Dame? Notre Dame does host Florida State on November 9th. They have to go to USC on November 30th. That'll be a tough game on the road. USC, fringe top 25 team. Maybe they're better. Maybe they're not as good. We'll find out as the season goes along. And they play at Texas A&M in week 1. In the event in which Notre Dame's undefeated, I wouldn't be surprised at all if they are hosting a playoff game. But in the event in which they lose 2, which is where I think they're going to end up at 10-2, then they're not going to have a ton of great wins at their disposal. Yeah, win against Louisville, good win. Win against A&M potentially, good win. Win at SC, good win potentially. Win against Florida State at home, good win. But they also could lose a couple of those games, which would obviously weaken their resume. They're going to have to travel, in my opinion, on the road in week 1 of the college football playoff. At number 10, the Ole Miss Rebels, who also at 10-2 finished 4th in the SEC. Yes, schedule's very good, but the strength of schedule not quite as good. Yes, there's some tough games in there for sure. Games against LSU, game against Georgia. In the event in which they beat Georgia, we could be having a completely different conversation. But the schedule for Ole Miss, relatively speaking, is pretty manageable. So at 10-2, you would think, yeah, they'd probably be in prime position to host a playoff game at Vaught Hemingway. But I don't think that's necessarily going to happen. I think Ole Miss is in the playoff, but they'll have to go on the road because their regular season schedule is not quite as difficult as Penn State and as Alabama, who sit currently right now at 7 and at 8. Moving on to team number 11, the 11 seed, and yet another from the Southeastern Conference. I think the LSU Tigers are going to be in position with 2 wins against Big Ten teams potentially, against USC, against a UCLA. And even though UCLA might not be a very good football team, maybe USC is, maybe they're not, what have you, doesn't really matter. I think those 2 games, when being measured against a team that might have finished 4th in the Big Ten, will give LSU the benefit of the doubt. Plus, they have played an SEC schedule. They're going to have some fireworks, and they're going to have some good wins at their disposal. Wins like Oklahoma, win potentially against Alabama, win potentially against Ole Miss, who sits at number 10. LSU has a lot of big opportunities on their schedule, and most of those opportunities come in Baton Rouge. So I think LSU, 9-3, 10-2, has a chance to still get in as an at-large, even if they're in 5th place in the SEC. And then finally, the 12 seed in the initial 12-team playoff, the G5 champion. This year, I'm going with the Memphis Tigers, the champions of the American Athletic Conference. Now, I don't think Memphis is going to be undefeated. I think Memphis might, at the end of the season, be 12-1, potentially 11-2. I don't think their record's going to be as good as Liberty's. I'm just going to be honest with you. I think Liberty has a cakewalk schedule. And the committee last year acknowledged that wins and losses, resume, very different from wins and loss record, okay? So if they're sitting there undefeated, sure, it's an easy conversation, but you're measuring an undefeated Liberty team with the strength of schedule that's in the 120s against a Memphis team that went and played against another playoff contender at Florida State. Maybe they measure up exactly how they fare there. Played against a really high-quality UTSA team on the road. Played at a really good Tulane team on the road and won the most competitive conference in the G5 over the last handful of years. I think Memphis will be given the benefit of the doubt this year, given the way Liberty performed last year. I don't think we need to evaluate teams and say, well, if they're 13-0, they are the best. That's not the case. Memphis will have challenged themselves and therefore might have a chance, even in loss, to prove that they belong in the college football playoff. So a reminder, number 1, Georgia, number 2, Ohio State, number 3, Miami, number 4, Utah. Those are your buys. Number 5, Oregon, number 6, Texas, number 7, Alabama, number 8, Penn State. Those are the 4 teams that will host home playoff games, and then teams that have to go on the road in the college football playoff. Number 9, Notre Dame, number 10, Ole Miss, number 11, LSU, and number 12, Memphis, champions of the American Athletic. To sum everything up, that's 5 from the SEC that I think will make the initial 12-team playoff. Feels like a lot, feels like a little. Let us know. I really think the SEC's depth and the fact that you're going to have a bunch of teams with pretty dang good records and pretty good resumes going to have them well positioned. So would you take an LSU, say at 9-3, 10-2 against potentially a 10-2 Iowa? I'd take LSU every day of the week in that scenario. personal opinion, I think LSU has better personnel than Iowa, and more often than not would win that game if they played on a neutral site. That's my own personal thought. But I'll be curious to see how the committee reacts. Are they going to be comfortable putting 5 SEC teams and just 3 Big Tens? Or do they feel like they need to split it up amongst the Big Ten and the SEC? Or will they be in a scenario where they look at the ACC, which in this simulation only gets 1 team in? Florida State would be on the outside looking in, as would Clemson. But both those teams I envision at this point at like a 9-3 seasons for both Clemson and for Florida State. What about the Big 12? They had only 1 team in as well. Well, I referenced the carnage that I expect in that league. So many different games that might be decided by a touchdown or less. And having 6 or 7 different teams that are capable of beating any team in the league on any one given night is going to be tough to handicap. That's why I think there's going to be too many losses in the loss column for some of their contenders, which is why I think the Big 12 only gets 1 in. So to sum it up, 5 for the SEC, 3 for the Big 10. Notre Dame gets in. 1 from the G5 is Memphis. And then the Big 12 and the ACC get only 1 representative here in the 12-team playoff in year number 1. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. I'm sure all of you will have consumed the last 38, 39 minutes of prognostication and probably taken it in stride. I'm sure there's no strong or visceral reaction to any of the things that we've come to in the last handful of minutes. I'm sure everyone agrees with all of our decisions, but hey, that's what's fun about it. And these things could be 5 for 5 like they were last year, or they could be horribly wrong. That's the beauty. If you disagree, it's all good. We'll agree to disagree. Let's just see how the season plays out. We'll be fascinating. It's going to be a great year and a lot of fun to evaluate. So to have a little bit more fun, I'll tell you my national champion pick. I'm taking the Ohio State Buckeyes to win the national championship here in 2024. They have, I think, a super dynamic run game. The defense has a chance to be elite. And I still believe that the offensive line, even though there are question marks, I still think the offensive line is going to be plenty good enough with Chip Kelly calling the plays in the run game to be able to complement what they want to be on the perimeter with the super talented weapons that they have at wide receiver. So the Ohio State Buckeyes over the Georgia Bulldogs for the national title. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. So for all of us here at ACF, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. Thanks so much for subscribing, for liking, for supporting the show, and continue to tell your friends about all the hard work that we're putting into making sure you have a great destination for college football content multiple times a week. So for all of us here at Always College Football, we'll see you next time. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.